I decided to take a break from the noise of the city and spend a weekend camping alone in the woods. I wasn't a stranger to the outdoors. I'd been camping since I was a kid. Something about being surrounded by nature always brought me peace. So, I packed my gear, drove a couple of hours out of town, and picked a secluded spot deep in the forest. The area I chose was beautiful. Towering pines stretched high into the sky, their needles forming a soft carpet beneath my boots. Birds chirped overhead, and a small stream bubbled nearby. It was perfect, calm, quiet, and exactly what I needed. By the time I set up camp, the sun was already dipping low, casting long shadows through the trees. I built a small fire, cooked a quick dinner, and leaned back against a log to enjoy the crackling flames. The air was cool but not cold, and the forest seemed alive with the rustling of leaves and the occasional hoot of an owl. It was peaceful, but as the night deepened, that peace began to unravel. It started with a sound, a faint rustle in the trees behind me. At first, I didn't think much of it. Animals are everywhere in the woods. Probably a deer or a raccoon, I told myself. But the sound wasn't random. It was steady, deliberate, like someone or something was moving through the underbrush, circling the edge of my camp. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it toward the trees. "Hello," I called out, my voice echoing in the stillness. No response. The beam of light swept across the forest, illuminating nothing but trees and shadows. I shook my head and chuckled nervously. "Get a grip," I muttered. The rustling stopped, and for a while, I let myself relax. I added a few more logs to the fire, the orange flames dancing higher into the night. But then I felt it, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. It's hard to explain, but it was like a weight pressing down on me, a primal instinct screaming that something wasn't right. I tried to ignore it, focusing on the fire, but my eyes kept drifting to the trees. And that's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light. A dark figure stood at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the reach of the fire's glow. It was tall, too tall, and unnaturally still. I couldn't make out any details, just a black silhouette against the darkness of the woods. "Hey," I called out, standing up. "Who's there?" No answer. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching me. My flashlight was still in my hand, so I pointed it toward the figure. But when the beam hit it, it didn't illuminate anything. It was like the light was swallowed up by the darkness surrounding it. My heart was pounding now. I shouted again, louder this time. "If you're messing with me, you better stop." Nothing. I took a step forward, but something in my gut told me not to get any closer. My instincts were screaming at me to stay by the fire, so I did. I picked up a heavy stick from the ground, my hands shaking as I gripped it tight. Then, in the blink of an eye, the figure was gone. 1 second it was there, and the next it wasn't. The clearing was empty again, and the only sound was the crackle of the fire. I stood frozen, my eyes darting from tree to tree, trying to convince myself that I'd imagined the whole thing. Maybe it was a shadow cast by the fire. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew better. I didn't sit back down. I couldn't. Every few minutes, I thought I saw movement in the trees, but when I looked closer, there was nothing there. The sense of being watched never left me, and the fire, once comforting, now felt like a beacon, making me an easy target. The hours dragged by. I kept the fire going, too afraid to let it die out, and clutched the stick like it was a lifeline. The woods were eerily quiet now, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Sometime around dawn, I finally let myself relax. The first rays of sunlight pierced through the trees, and the oppressive darkness began to lift. I still felt uneasy, but the light brought a sense of safety I hadn't felt all night. I decided to pack up and leave as quickly as possible. As I gathered my things, I glanced over to where the figure had stood. That's when I saw it, a strange symbol etched into the dirt. It looked like a circle with jagged lines radiating out from the center, almost like a sunburst. But there was something unsettling about it, something that made my skin crawl. I hadn't put it there, and I knew it hadn't been there when I set up camp. I didn't stick around to investigate. I grabbed my backpack, stomped out the fire, and practically ran back to my car. The entire way, I felt like I was being followed, though I never saw or heard anything. When I finally reached my car and locked the doors, I sat there for a long time, trying to process what had happened. To this day, I don't know what I saw in the woods that night. Was it a person? A ghost? Something else entirely? All I know is that I haven't been camping alone since, and I never will again. It started as an ordinary hike, a day meant for fresh air and a break from the usual grind. My friend Ben and I decided to explore a remote trail deep in the woods. Ben had found the trail online, labeled as untouched, which meant it wasn't overrun with people. That's exactly what we wanted, a chance to escape the noise of the city. The first part of the hike was beautiful. The trees were tall and dense, their leaves forming a green canopy above us. Birds chirped, and the occasional rustle of a squirrel in the bushes kept us company. The air was fresh and cool, the kind of air that clears your head and makes you feel alive. We followed the trail for hours, stopping now and then to drink water or take in the scenery. Everything seemed perfect, until it wasn't. It started when we heard the scream. At first, it was distant, barely audible over the sound of the wind rustling the trees. But there was no mistaking it. It was high-pitched, sharp, and chilling. Ben and I froze, staring at each other in confusion. "Did you hear that?" I asked. "Yeah," Ben said, his face pale. "What the hell was that?" We stood there for a moment, listening. The scream came again, louder this time. It sounded like it was coming from deeper in the woods, off the trail. "Maybe someone's hurt," I said. "We should check it out." Ben hesitated. "Are you sure?" It sounded weird, like not normal. I didn't want to admit it, but he was right. There was something unnatural about the scream, something that made my skin crawl. But if someone was in trouble, we couldn't just leave them. "Let's just take a quick look," I said. "If it's nothing, we'll come back to the trail." Reluctantly, Ben agreed, and we headed toward the sound. The deeper we went, the harder it became to follow. The scream would come, sharp and clear, but when we moved in that direction, it seemed to shift. It was like the sound was bouncing off the trees, coming from everywhere and nowhere all at once. As we walked, the forest around us started to change. The trees grew denser, their branches twisting together like skeletal hands. The sunlight barely made it through the canopy, casting eerie shadows on the forest floor. The air felt heavier, colder, and the once cheerful sounds of birds and rustling leaves were gone. I checked my phone, hoping to use the GPS to find our way back to the trail, but there was no signal. Ben's phone was dead, which didn't help my growing sense of unease. The scream came again, this time so close it made us both jump. It was louder, more piercing than before, and it seemed to come from just ahead. We quickened our pace, pushing through the underbrush, until we stumbled into a small clearing. At the center of the clearing was an old cabin. It looked abandoned, its wooden walls weathered and gray, the roof sagging in the middle. There were no windows, just a single door that hung slightly ajar. "Should we go in?" I asked, though every instinct was screaming at me not to. Ben shook his head. "I don't like this." That scream, it didn't sound human. Before I could respond, the scream came again. But this time, it wasn't coming from the woods, it was coming from the cabin. It was deafening, a sound so shrill and full of anguish that it made my head pound. Ben covered his ears, and I did the same, but it didn't help. The sound seemed to seep into my skull, vibrating through my entire body. "Let's get out of here," Ben shouted, his voice barely audible over the scream. We turned and ran, not caring about the trail or the direction. We just needed to get as far away from that cabin as possible. But no matter how far we ran, the scream didn't stop. It followed us, growing fainter but never disappearing completely. It was always there, lingering at the edge of hearing, like a shadow we couldn't shake. By the time we finally stumbled back onto the trail, the sun was setting. We were exhausted, our clothes torn from the branches we'd crashed through. The scream was still there, faint but persistent. When we reached the car, I thought we were safe. We climbed in, locked the doors, and sat there catching our breath. But as we started driving away, the scream grew louder again, as if it were chasing us. "What the hell is going on?" Ben shouted, gripping the steering wheel tightly. "I don't know," I yelled back, panic rising in my chest. We sped down the winding forest road, and eventually, the scream began to fade. By the time we reached the main highway, it was gone. We didn't talk much on the drive back to the city. What was there to say? Whatever we had experienced in those woods wasn't something we could explain. For days afterward, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I kept hearing faint noises at night, like whispers just out of earshot. And sometimes, just as I was falling asleep, I'd hear that scream again, distant but unmistakable. Ben and I promised never to go back to that trail. I still think about the cabin sometimes, wondering who, or what, might have been inside. But one thing is certain, that scream wasn't human. And whatever made it, I hope I never hear it again. Camping alone in the woods had always been my way of finding peace. Life in the city could be overwhelming, with the constant noise, deadlines, and endless distractions. In the forest, everything was quiet, calm, and far removed from the chaos of everyday life. I had done it many times before, always enjoying the solitude and the chance to reconnect with nature. But this trip was different. I had picked a spot deep in the woods, far away from any roads or trails. It was the kind of place where you wouldn't run into another soul for miles. I set up my tent, gathered some firewood, and prepared for a relaxing evening under the stars. By the time the sun began to set, my little campsite was perfect. The fire crackled warmly, casting flickering light on the surrounding trees. I had a simple meal of canned soup and crackers, then leaned back against a log, gazing up at the stars. The forest was alive with the sounds of nature, crickets chirping, leaves rustling in the breeze, and the occasional hoot of an owl. It was peaceful, exactly what I needed. Around midnight, I decided to call it a night. I extinguished the fire, crawled into my tent, and zipped it up tight. The air was cool and refreshing, and the rhythmic sounds of the forest quickly lulled me towards sleep. But just as I was about to drift off, I heard it. At first, it was faint, almost imperceptible. A soft crunching sound, like footsteps on dry leaves. I froze, my eyes snapping open in the darkness. The sound was coming from outside the tent, slow and deliberate. I held my breath, straining to listen. The footsteps circled my tent, moving steadily but never stopping. My heart began to race. Probably just an animal, I whispered to myself, trying to stay calm. A deer maybe, or a raccoon. Animals wander through campsites all the time. But something about the sound was unsettling. It wasn't random, like the scurrying of a small creature. It was too measured, too intentional. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling slightly. The footsteps stopped. The sudden silence was deafening. I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears as I waited for a response. None came. I fumbled for my flashlight, my hands shaking as I turned it on. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the inside of my tent. I unzipped the door slowly, my heart hammering in my chest, and shone the light outside. Nothing. The campsite was empty. The trees stood motionless in the still night air, and the ground around my tent was undisturbed. I swept the flashlight beam back and forth, half expecting to see glowing eyes staring back at me, but there was nothing there. I let out a shaky breath and zipped the tent closed again. "Just an animal," I muttered, trying to convince myself. But deep down, I wasn't so sure. I lay back down, but sleep didn't come. Every rustle of leaves, every creak of a tree branch made me jump. I told myself it was all in my head, that I was overreacting. And then the footsteps started again. This time they were louder, closer. They circled my tent once more, slow and deliberate, pausing just outside the thin nylon walls. I sat up, clutching the flashlight like a weapon. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice echoing through the trees. Again, the footsteps stopped. The silence was even more unnerving than the sound. My mind raced with possibilities. Could it be another camper messing with me? A hunter who had wandered too close? Or something else entirely? I didn't wait to find out. I unzipped the tent again and stepped outside, the flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. My breath came in quick, shallow bursts as I scanned the area. "Show yourself," I yelled. Nothing moved. The forest was utterly still, as if holding its breath. The only sound was the pounding of my heart. I turned in a slow circle, the flashlight trembling in my hand. And that's when I noticed something strange. The ground around my tent was undisturbed, no footprints, no trampled leaves. The footsteps had sounded so close, but there was no evidence that anyone, or anything, had been there. A cold chill ran down my spine. I backed toward the tent, my eyes darting from tree to tree. The flashlight's beam seemed weaker, as if the darkness was pressing in around me. I crawled back inside the tent and zipped it up tight, my hands shaking so badly I could barely grip the zipper. I sat there for what felt like hours, the flashlight clutched in one hand and a heavy stick I'd found earlier in the other. The footsteps didn't come again that night, but I didn't sleep. Every sound, every whisper of wind, sent a jolt of fear through me. As soon as the first rays of sunlight pierced the darkness, I packed up my gear as quickly as I could. I didn't even bother with breakfast. I just wanted to get out of those woods. As I walked back toward the trailhead, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The forest seemed different in the daylight, less threatening, but still unnervingly quiet. When I finally reached my car, I threw my gear into the trunk and climbed in, locking the doors behind me. I sat there for a moment, trying to calm my racing heart. Driving away, I couldn't help but glance in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone, or something, standing at the edge of the trees. But there was nothing there. To this day, I don't know what I experienced that night. Was it just my imagination? An animal? A person trying to scare me? Or something else entirely? I've gone camping since then, but never alone. That night taught me that the woods, for all their beauty, can also be a deeply unsettling place. And sometimes, the things we can't see are the ones that haunt us the most. I loved hiking. There was something about the fresh air, the sounds of birds, and the crunch of leaves underfoot that always calmed my mind. It was my way of escaping the stresses of life. So when I had a free weekend, I decided to revisit a trail I'd hiked many times before. I knew it like the back of my hand, every turn, every tree, every marker. Or at least, I thought I did. The weather was perfect that day. The sky was a bright, cloudless blue, and the sun filtered through the trees, casting golden light on the forest floor. I parked my car at the trailhead, grabbed my backpack, and set off. The first part of the hike was as familiar as ever. The trail wound gently through the woods, marked by bright orange blazes painted on the trees. I passed the old oak with its twisted branches, the moss-covered boulder I always stopped at for a water break, and the little stream where I'd often see deer drinking. It felt good to be back. About an hour in, though, things started to feel off. I noticed the forest was unusually quiet. Normally, I'd hear birds singing, squirrels chattering, or the distant rustle of leaves in the breeze. But now there was nothing. Just silence. Even my own footsteps sounded muffled, as if the forest was swallowing the noise. I brushed it off at first, telling myself I was just being paranoid. But then I noticed something else. The trail markers, the orange blazes I'd been following, seemed to be getting harder to spot. I stopped and looked around. The trees were the same as I remembered, tall and straight, their bark rough and dark. But the trail itself seemed different. The path was narrower, the ground softer, almost like it hadn't been walked on in years. I shook my head and kept going. Maybe I'd just missed a marker. It wouldn't be the first time. But the farther I went, the stranger things became. The familiar landmarks, the oak tree, the boulder, the stream, were gone. In their place were trees I didn't recognize, their trunks gnarled and twisted, their branches reaching out like skeletal arms. The air grew heavier, colder, and the sunlight that had been so bright earlier was now dim and pale. I stopped again, this time with a sinking feeling in my stomach. I wasn't on the trail anymore. Panic began to set in. I took out my phone, hoping to check my GPS, but of course, there was no signal. The map I'd brought with me was useless without the trail markers to guide me. I turned around, determined to retrace my steps. But as I walked back, nothing looked familiar. The trees all looked the same, and there were no footprints or other signs to show where I'd come from. It was as if the forest had swallowed the trail completely. I tried to stay calm. I'd been hiking for years. I knew how to navigate, how to find my way back if I got lost. But no matter which direction I went, the forest seemed to stretch on forever, endless and unchanging. Hours passed. The sun began to sink lower in the sky, casting long shadows that twisted and danced across the ground. My legs ached, my throat was dry, and my stomach growled with hunger. But more than anything, I was scared. Every now and then, I thought I heard something, a faint rustling in the bushes, a soft whisper that seemed to come from nowhere. I'd stop and look around, but there was never anyone there. I called out a few times, shouting for help, but my voice seemed to die in the air, swallowed by the dense trees. By the time the sun set completely, I was exhausted and terrified. The forest was pitch black now, the only light coming from my flashlight. Shadows danced in the beam, and every sound seemed magnified. I decided to stop and rest, knowing I couldn't keep wandering aimlessly in the dark. I found a spot near a cluster of rocks and sat down, pulling my jacket tighter around me. The forest felt alive, the trees looming over me like silent sentinels. I don't know how long I sat there, but at some point, I must have dozed off. When I woke up, it was still dark, but something had changed. The air was colder, and the forest was completely silent. No wind, no rustling leaves, nothing. And then I heard it. A soft, rhythmic tapping sound, like footsteps on the forest floor. My heart started pounding as the sound grew louder, coming closer. I turned on my flashlight, shining it in the direction of the noise. Nothing. The footsteps stopped, and I sat there, frozen with fear. After a few minutes, I convinced myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. But then it started again, this time circling me. I grabbed my flashlight and stood up, my legs trembling. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice cracking. The footsteps stopped again, and for a moment, everything was silent. Then, just beyond the edge of the flashlight's beam, I saw something move. It was quick, just a flicker of motion, but it was enough to make my blood run cold. I didn't wait to see what it was. I grabbed my backpack and started walking, moving as fast as I could without running. The footsteps followed me, always just out of sight, matching my pace. At some point, I stumbled into a small clearing. The moonlight illuminated a single tree in the center, its bark pale and smooth, almost like bone. I didn't recognize it, but I didn't care. I was too tired and scared to keep walking. I sat down at the base of the tree, leaning against its trunk, and tried to catch my breath. The footsteps had stopped again, and for the first time in hours, I felt a small sense of relief. But as I looked around the clearing, I noticed something strange. The trees at the edge of the clearing seemed to shift and sway, even though there was no wind. Their branches reached toward me, their shadows stretching across the ground like clawed hands. I closed my eyes, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. When I opened them again, the forest was gone. I was standing on the side of the highway, my backpack on my shoulders, my flashlight still clutched in my hand. My car was parked a few feet away, exactly where I'd left it. The sun was just starting to rise, painting the sky with streaks of pink and orange. I stood there, staring at the forest, trying to make sense of what had happened. Had I imagined it all? Had I somehow found my way back without realizing it? I don't know. What I do know is that I haven't been back to that trail, or any trail, since. The forest may be beautiful, but it's also unpredictable, mysterious, and sometimes downright terrifying. And whatever happened to me that day, I'm not sure I ever want to know the truth. I'd always loved exploring abandoned places. Something about the mystery of forgotten locations and the stories they might hold drew me in. When I heard about an old watchtower deep in the woods near my town, I couldn't resist. People said it had been left to rot for decades, and while most locals avoided it, the adventurer in me was intrigued. One Saturday, I packed my gear, flashlight, water, a small first aid kit, and some snacks, and drove out to the edge of the forest. The watchtower wasn't on any official trail, but I had found vague directions online. It was supposed to be about a 2-hour hike into the woods, isolated and surrounded by dense trees. The weather was perfect that day, with clear skies and a cool breeze. The forest was alive with the sounds of birds chirping and leaves rustling. I followed the rough path described in the online guide, confident I'd find the watchtower before the afternoon was over. After about an hour, the trail started to fade. The trees grew closer together, their branches intertwining overhead and blocking out much of the sunlight. The air felt cooler here, almost unnaturally so, and the forest seemed quieter. Still, I pushed on, determined to reach my destination. It wasn't long before I saw it. The watchtower stood tall and skeletal, its wooden frame darkened with age and weathered by decades of exposure. The structure leaned slightly to one side, and vines crept up its supports, as if nature were trying to reclaim it. The sight sent a thrill through me. This was exactly the kind of place I loved exploring. I approached cautiously, the forest around me eerily silent now. Even the birds seemed to have stopped singing. The base of the tower was surrounded by overgrown grass and weeds. As I got closer, I noticed old, rusted tools scattered on the ground. An axe, a shovel, and what looked like the remains of a wheelbarrow. The wooden ladder leading up to the tower's platform creaked as I tested it with my hand. It seemed stable enough, though I made a mental note to be careful. I climbed slowly, the wood groaning under my weight, until I reached the platform at the top. The view was breathtaking. From up here, I could see miles of dense forest stretching in every direction, the treetops swaying gently in the wind. The sun was starting to dip lower in the sky, casting a warm, golden light over the landscape. But as I stood there, taking it all in, I heard it. A faint cry, distant but unmistakable. It was the sound of a child crying. At first, I thought I had imagined it. The wind, maybe, or some animal that sounded human. But then it came again, louder this time and more desperate. "Hello," I called out, my voice carrying through the forest. The crying stopped abruptly, as if whoever, or whatever, had made the sound knew I was listening. A chill ran down my spine. I scanned the forest below, but I didn't see anything out of the ordinary. Still, the sound had been so clear, so real. "Is someone out there?" I tried again. No response. I decided to climb back down and investigate. If there really was a child lost in the woods, I couldn't just leave them. The ladder groaned under my weight as I descended, the sound echoing in the stillness. Once I reached the ground, I stood there for a moment, listening. The forest was silent again, the kind of silence that felt heavy and oppressive. Then, just as I was about to give up and head back, the crying started again. It was closer now, coming from somewhere deeper in the woods. I grabbed my flashlight, it was getting darker, and followed the sound, my heart pounding in my chest. As I walked, the crying seemed to move. It would echo from one direction, then another, as if leading me deeper into the forest. The trees grew thicker, their twisted branches forming dark shapes that looked like they could reach out and grab me. "Where are you?" I called, my voice trembling. "I'm here to help." The crying stopped again, and I froze, straining to hear anything else. The air was deathly still, and I realized with a sinking feeling that I had no idea where I was anymore. I turned in a slow circle, shining my flashlight on the trees around me. They all looked the same, tall, dark, and foreboding. There were no landmarks, no signs of the watchtower or the path I had followed. Panic started to creep in. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. I had my phone in my pocket, and even if there was no signal, I could use the GPS to find my way back. But when I pulled out my phone, the screen was black. It wouldn't turn on, even though I had charged it fully before leaving. That's when I heard the whisper. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there, a soft, low murmur coming from somewhere behind me. I whipped around, shining my flashlight in the direction of the sound. Nothing. "Hello," I called out, my voice shaking. The whisper came again, closer this time, but I couldn't make out the words. It was like someone was speaking just out of earshot, their voice blending with the rustle of the leaves. I started walking faster, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly as I tried to find my way back to the watchtower. But no matter which direction I went, the forest seemed to stretch endlessly. The crying started again, louder and more frantic than before. It echoed all around me, making it impossible to tell where it was coming from. "Stop it!" I shouted, my voice cracking. "Who's there? What do you want?" The crying stopped abruptly, replaced by a deep, guttural growl that made my blood run cold. I froze, my flashlight shaking in my hand. The growl came again, this time from somewhere behind me. Slowly, I turned, the beam of light cutting through the darkness. For a moment, I saw nothing, just trees and shadows. But then something moved. It was quick, a dark shape that darted between the trees, too fast for me to get a good look. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I turned and ran, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The forest seemed alive now, the trees closing in around me, their branches clawing at my clothes. The ground was uneven, and I stumbled several times, barely managing to keep my balance. The growling followed me, always just out of sight, and I could hear something crashing through the underbrush behind me. Whatever it was getting closer. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually, I burst into another clearing. I collapsed to my knees, gasping for air, and looked around wildly. The watchtower was there, standing tall and silent against the darkening sky. I scrambled to my feet and ran toward it, climbing the ladder as fast as I could. The wood groaned under my weight, but I didn't care. I needed to get away from whatever was chasing me. When I reached the platform, I pulled the ladder up behind me and sat down, clutching my flashlight like a lifeline. The forest below was dark and still, but I knew it was out there, whatever it was. I sat there all night, too scared to move, listening to the whispers and cries that echoed through the forest. When dawn finally broke, the sound stopped, and the forest seemed to return to normal. I climbed down from the tower and made my way back to my car as quickly as I could, not stopping to rest until I was safely inside with the doors locked. I've never gone back to that watchtower, and I don't think I ever will. Whatever I encountered in those woods wasn't human, and the cries I heard still haunt my dreams. The forest is a place of beauty, but it's also a place of mystery, and sometimes those mysteries are better left alone. I've always loved the woods. Growing up, I spent countless weekends hiking, camping, and exploring trails. For me, the forest was a place of peace, a refuge from the noise and chaos of daily life. But after what happened that one weekend, I can't look at the woods the same way anymore. It started as a simple trip. I had a long weekend ahead and decided to spend it hiking a trail I'd never explored before. I'd read about it online, a less traveled path deep in the forest, leading to stunning views and untouched nature. It sounded perfect. I packed my backpack with the usual gear: a flashlight, extra batteries, water, some food, and my trusty camping knife. I also brought a small tent and sleeping bag, planning to camp overnight before heading back. The weather was crisp and cool that morning, with a gentle breeze rustling the trees. The trail was easy to follow at first, winding through dense forest with the occasional clearing. I saw signs of wildlife, deer tracks, birds fluttering between branches, and felt completely at ease. By early afternoon, I had reached a fork in the trail. One path continued deeper into the woods, while the other looked overgrown and unused. I checked my map, but found nothing about the second trail. My curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to follow the overgrown path. At first, it was peaceful. The trail was narrow, but I could still make out where others might have walked long ago. The trees here were older, their twisted branches forming a canopy that filtered the sunlight into soft, golden rays. The air was cooler, and the forest felt almost magical. But as I walked further, the atmosphere began to change. The air grew heavier, and the light seemed dimmer, even though it was still midday. The sounds of the forest, the chirping birds, the rustling leaves, faded until there was only silence. I stopped, suddenly uneasy, and looked around. The trees seemed taller here, their bark darker and rougher. The overgrown trail was barely visible now, and I wondered if I should turn back. That's when I saw the cabin. It was hidden among the trees, its weathered wood blending into the forest. The roof sagged in places, and the windows were dark and broken. Ivy crept up the walls, and the front door hung slightly ajar. I don't know why I felt drawn to it. Something about the cabin seemed out of place, as if it didn't belong there. But instead of turning around, I walked closer. The ground around the cabin was littered with debris, old tools, broken furniture, and what looked like the remains of a fire pit. The air here was colder, and a faint, musty smell hung in the air. "Hello," I called out, my voice sounding too loud in the eerie silence. No answer. I stepped onto the porch, the wooden boards creaking under my weight. The door swung open wider with a low, groaning sound, revealing the dark interior. I hesitated. Every instinct told me to leave, to go back the way I came. But curiosity won out. I turned on my flashlight and stepped inside. The cabin was small, with just one main room and a loft above. Dust covered every surface, and cobwebs hung from the rafters. There was a table in the center of the room, its surface scarred and stained. A few chairs were scattered around, one of them lying on its side. On the far wall, a stone fireplace stood cold and empty. Above it hung a framed photograph, its glass cracked. I walked closer, shining my flashlight on the picture. It was faded and yellowed with age, showing a family of 4, a man, a woman, and 2 young children. Something about their faces made me uneasy. Their smiles looked strained, almost forced, and their eyes seemed wrong. The longer I looked at the photograph, the more uncomfortable I felt. I turned away, my flashlight beam sweeping across the room. That's when I noticed the scratches. They were on the walls, deep gouges in the wood that looked like they had been made by claws. Some were long and jagged, running from the floor to the ceiling, while others were shorter, clustered near the door. A chill ran down my spine. I told myself it was probably from an animal, a bear maybe, but the marks didn't look like any I'd seen before. I moved toward the loft ladder, drawn by a faint sound, like a whisper, just barely audible. "Hello." I called again, my voice trembling. No response. I climbed the ladder slowly, my flashlight shaking in my hand. The loft was small, just a platform with an old mattress and a few tattered blankets. The smell was stronger up here, damp and decayed. I scanned the loft with my flashlight, my heart pounding. At first, I saw nothing unusual, but then the beam landed on something in the corner. A small doll. It was old, its fabric body stained, and its button eyes hanging loosely. One of its arms was missing, and its hair was matted with dirt. I felt a sudden wave of unease, like I was being watched. I turned quickly, shining my flashlight around the room, but there was nothing there. That's when I heard it. a soft, rhythmic tapping sound, like footsteps on the wooden floor below. My breath caught in my throat. The sound was slow and deliberate, moving from one side of the cabin to the other. I crouched down, trying to stay quiet, and peered over the edge of the loft. The cabin below was empty, just as I had left it. But the footsteps continued, circling the room. I stayed frozen, my mind racing. Was it an animal? Another person? Or something else entirely? The footsteps stopped suddenly, and the silence that followed was even more terrifying. Then, from the far corner of the room, I heard a faint whisper. "Leave." I didn't wait to hear more. I scrambled down the ladder, nearly tripping in my haste, and bolted out of the cabin. The forest outside was darker now, the trees casting long shadows in the fading light. I ran back the way I had come, my flashlight bouncing wildly in my hand. But the trail was gone. The overgrown path I had followed was nowhere to be found. I spun in circles, panicking, but all I saw were trees, endless, towering trees. I tried to retrace my steps, but the forest seemed different now, the air heavier and the shadows deeper. Every now and then, I thought I heard footsteps behind me, but when I turned, there was nothing there. Hours passed as I wandered aimlessly, my fear growing with every step. The whispers followed me, faint and mocking, always just out of reach. When I finally stumbled out of the forest, it was nearly dawn. I had no idea how I'd found my way back, but I didn't care. My car was still parked where I had left it, and I practically threw myself inside, locking the doors behind me. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone, or something, standing at the edge of the trees. But there was nothing. I haven't gone hiking since that day, and I don't think I ever will. Whatever I encountered in that cabin wasn't human, and the memories of that night still haunt me. The forest may be beautiful, but it's also a place of mystery, and some mysteries are better left alone. It all started on a sunny morning. I'd been planning this solo hiking trip for weeks, excited to escape the hustle and bustle of the city. I'd picked a trail I'd never explored before, a remote path winding through dense woods and leading to a small, crystal-clear lake. The perfect weekend getaway. I packed light but smart. A flashlight, extra batteries, water, snacks, a small first aid kit, a map, and my favorite pocket knife. The forecast promised clear skies, and I couldn't wait to lose myself in the peace and quiet of nature. The trailhead was nearly an hour's drive from the nearest town. I parked my car in a small gravel lot surrounded by towering pines. There were no other cars there, which didn't surprise me. This wasn't a popular trail. That was part of the appeal. The first couple of hours were bliss. The forest was alive with the sounds of birds and the rustle of leaves. Sunlight streamed through the canopy, casting dappled patterns on the forest floor. I breathed in the fresh, earthy air and felt my stress melting away with every step. As I walked, the trail grew narrower and more overgrown. It was clear this part of the forest didn't see many visitors. Branches reached out like skeletal fingers, scratching at my arms and legs. The further I went, the quieter it became. It was around midday when I first noticed it, the feeling of being watched. At first, I dismissed it as paranoia. I was alone in an unfamiliar forest, after all. Of course, my mind would play tricks on me, but the sensation persisted. I found myself glancing over my shoulder every few minutes, expecting to see someone, or something, following me. There was nothing there. The trail eventually opened up into a small clearing. I decided it was a good spot to rest and eat lunch. I sat on a fallen log, munching on a granola bar and sipping water, trying to shake the unsettling feeling. The silence was unnerving. The birds had stopped singing, and the usual forest noises were absent. It was as if the entire woods were holding their breath. Then I heard it, a branch snapping somewhere behind me. I froze, my heart pounding. Slowly, I turned, scanning the trees with wide eyes. The forest was still, the shadows between the trees deep and foreboding. "Hello," I called, my voice trembling slightly. No response. I tried to laugh it off. Probably just an animal, I told myself. A deer or a squirrel. Nothing to worry about. But as I packed up my things and prepared to move on, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I walked faster now, my eyes darting from side to side. The trail seemed to stretch endlessly, winding through the thick forest. Every so often, I thought I heard faint footsteps behind me, matching my pace. When I stopped, they stopped. When I moved, they moved. My heart raced as I whipped around, shining my flashlight into the shadows. The beam illuminated trees and underbrush, but nothing else. Is someone there? I shouted, trying to sound braver than I felt. Silence. I pressed on, my grip tightening on my pocket knife. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the trail. I needed to find a place to camp before it got dark, but the thought of stopping made my skin crawl. As dusk settled over the forest, the noises began. At first, it was faint, a soft rustling, like leaves shifting in the wind. But there was no wind. Then came the whispers, low and unintelligible, as if someone were speaking just out of earshot. "Who's there?" I shouted again, my voice echoing through the trees. No answer. I kept walking, my flashlight now in hand as the darkness deepened. The trail was barely visible, and the forest around me seemed to close in. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, but I couldn't make out the words. That's when I saw it, a shadow darting between the trees, too fast for me to focus on. I stopped, my breath catching in my throat. The shadow didn't move like an animal. It was tall and humanoid, its movements unnaturally quick and jerky. "Stay back," I yelled, holding out my knife. The forest fell silent again, but I knew it was still there. Watching, waiting. Panic set in as I realized I was hopelessly lost. The trail had disappeared, swallowed by the forest. My map was useless without landmarks, and my phone had no signal this deep in the woods. I stumbled through the underbrush, desperate to find some sign of civilization. The whispers followed me, growing louder and more distorted. Sometimes they sounded like voices, other times like laughter. Then came the footsteps, slow, deliberate, and far too close. I turned, shining my flashlight wildly, but saw nothing. The footsteps circled me, moving just beyond the edge of the light. "Leave me alone," I screamed, my voice cracking. The footsteps stopped. For a moment, there was silence again. Then, from somewhere behind me, a low, guttural growl broke the stillness. I ran. Branches tore at my clothes and scratched my face as I crashed through the underbrush. My flashlight bounced in my hand, its beam slicing through the darkness. I didn't care where I was going. I just needed to get away. The growling followed me, growing louder and more feral. It sounded closer with every step, as if whatever was chasing me was gaining ground. I tripped over a root and fell hard, the impact knocking the wind out of me. My flashlight flew from my hand, its beam flickering before going out. I scrambled to my feet, frantically searching for the light. The growling was deafening now, coming from somewhere just behind me. My fingers closed around the flashlight, and I clicked it back on, spinning around to face whatever was there. But there was nothing. The growling stopped, and the forest was silent once more. I stood there, shaking and gasping for breath, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The shadows seemed to shift and move, but I couldn't tell if it was my imagination or something real. Then, I heard the whisper again. It was right next to my ear. "Run." I didn't need to be told twice. I ran blindly through the forest, my legs burning and my lungs aching. I didn't know where I was going, but I couldn't stop. The whispers followed me, growing louder and more frantic, overlapping into a cacophony of voices. When I finally burst into a clearing, I collapsed to my knees, gasping for air. The clearing was bathed in moonlight, and in the center stood a massive, ancient tree. Its gnarled branches twisted upward, and its trunk was scarred with deep grooves, as if clawed by some enormous creature. The whispers stopped. For a moment, there was only the sound of my ragged breathing. I turned, half expecting to see the shadowy figure standing at the edge of the clearing. But the forest was empty. I didn't trust it. I backed away slowly, keeping my flashlight trained on the trees, until I reached the far side of the clearing. That's when I saw it. Carved into the bark of the ancient tree was a single word: leave. I didn't hesitate. I turned and ran. The word burned into my mind. Hours later, as the first light of dawn broke through the trees, I stumbled onto a dirt road. My legs were weak, and my entire body ached, but I kept going until I saw a small cabin in the distance. An elderly couple lived there, and they were kind enough to let me use their phone to call for help. When I told them where I'd been, their faces grew pale. "That trail's been closed for years," the man said. "People go missing out there. The ones who come back, they're never the same." I didn't argue. I thanked them for their help and left as soon as I could. I haven't been back to the woods since. Whatever followed me that night wasn't human, and I know it's still out there, waiting for its next victim. The forest may look peaceful and inviting, but it hides things we're not meant to understand. Some places are meant to be left alone. When I was young, my grandparents often warned me about the woods near their house. The forest was dense, dark, and quiet, except for the occasional rustling of leaves or the call of a bird. But there was one story they always repeated, a tale about the whistler. According to the legend, anyone who heard whistling in those woods should never whistle back. It was said to be an old spirit, a guardian of the forest who didn't like being mocked. If you whistled back, you were inviting it closer. At first, I thought it was just an old tale to keep kids like me from wandering too far into the woods. But something about the way my grandparents told it, with serious faces and hushed voices, made me uneasy. As I grew older, my curiosity about the legend only grew. I had always been a skeptic, someone who didn't believe in ghosts or spirits. The story of the whistler seemed like just another made-up tale. So one summer when I was 16, I decided to prove that there was nothing to be afraid of. I borrowed a small tent from a friend, packed some snacks, a flashlight, and a sleeping bag, and headed into the woods one evening. My grandparents weren't thrilled about the idea of me camping alone, but I assured them I'd be fine. I wanted to face the fear head-on and show them that their stories were just that, stories. The forest was eerily quiet as I walked deeper into it. The sunlight filtering through the leaves started to fade, and soon, the trees cast long, dark shadows. I found a small clearing and decided to set up my tent there. It was a peaceful spot, surrounded by tall trees, and I felt confident as I prepared for the night. After eating a quick snack, I sat outside my tent and watched as the sun dipped below the horizon. The sky turned a deep shade of orange before fading into darkness. I lit a small lantern and placed it beside me, listening to the sounds of the forest. Crickets chirped, and the occasional rustle of leaves kept me alert. Around midnight, the woods grew quieter. The crickets stopped chirping, and even the rustling leaves seemed to hold their breath. That's when I heard it, a soft, melodic whistle cutting through the stillness. At first, I thought it might be the wind, but as I listened closer, the sound was too deliberate, too controlled. It started low, then rose to a higher pitch, like someone was whistling a tune. My heart began to race. I tried to brush it off, convincing myself it was just another camper nearby or some kind of bird. But the whistling continued, moving through the trees. It seemed to come from different directions, as if the forest itself was alive and playing tricks on me. My mind went back to the stories my grandparents had told me. They had warned me about this. Despite my fear, a part of me wanted to test the legend. Was there really something out there, or was my imagination running wild? I took a deep breath and, against my better judgment, whistled back. The moment I did, the forest went completely silent. The whistling stopped. No crickets, no rustling leaves, nothing. It was as if the world had been put on pause. I sat there frozen, staring into the dark woods, waiting for something to happen. Then I heard it, the sound of footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, and crunching on the dry leaves just outside my tent. My hands shook as I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it toward the sound. I couldn't see anything, just shadows and trees. The footsteps circled my tent, moving closer with each pass. My breathing grew shallow, and my chest felt tight. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling. "Is someone there?" There was no response. Instead, the whistling started again, this time much closer. It was behind me, then to my left, then my right, as if something was circling me faster than any human could. I zipped myself inside the tent, clutching the flashlight like it was a weapon. The whistling grew louder, almost deafening, and I could swear I heard faint laughter mixed in with the sound. It wasn't the laughter of a person. It was distorted, like a record being played backward. I wanted to leave, to run back home, but I was paralyzed with fear. I thought about calling for help, but who would believe me? My phone was in my bag, and I didn't dare reach for it. Then, just as suddenly as it started, everything stopped. The footsteps, the whistling, the laughter, it all vanished. The silence returned, but it wasn't comforting. It was heavy, oppressive, like the forest was holding its breath, waiting for me to make a move. I sat in my tent for hours, unable to sleep, listening for any sound. When the first rays of sunlight peeked through the trees, I finally felt brave enough to step outside. The clearing looked the same as it had the night before, but something felt different. The air was colder, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I packed up my tent as quickly as I could and made my way back home. Every step felt like it took an eternity, and I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see something following me. But the forest remained quiet, almost too quiet. When I reached my grandparents' house, they didn't need to ask what had happened. They could see it in my face. I told them everything, and they just nodded, as if they already knew. My grandfather put a hand on my shoulder and said, "Now you understand. Some things aren't meant to be tested." I never went back into those woods. To this day, the sound of whistling sends a chill down my spine. I don't know what I heard that night, but I'm sure of one thing: it wasn't human. It was supposed to be a normal hike. I had always loved the woods, the peace, the solitude, and the chance to escape from the noise of everyday life. The forest was my place to think, to clear my head, and to feel connected to something bigger. I had hiked many trails in the area, but that day, I decided to explore a path I hadn't taken before. The sun was high in the sky when I started, its golden light filtering through the trees. The air was fresh, and the ground was soft under my boots. Everything felt calm, like the woods were welcoming me. The trail wasn't marked, but it seemed clear enough. I followed it deeper into the forest, enjoying the sounds of birds and the rustling of leaves in the breeze. After about an hour, the trail began to change. The trees grew closer together, their branches creating a canopy that blocked out most of the sunlight. The air felt cooler, heavier, and the cheerful sounds of the forest grew quieter. It was as if I had stepped into a different world. That's when I saw it, a small, abandoned cabin, hidden among the trees. The wood was old and weathered, the roof sagging in places. Moss and vines crept up the walls, and the windows were dark and empty. It looked like no one had been there for decades. Curiosity tugged at me. Who had built it? Why had it been left to rot? I told myself I'd just take a quick look. After all, it wasn't every day you stumbled upon something like this in the middle of nowhere. As I approached the cabin, a strange feeling came over me. It was hard to explain, but it felt like the forest was watching me, holding its breath. The closer I got, the quieter everything became. Even the wind seemed to stop. The door was slightly ajar, hanging crookedly on rusted hinges. I pushed it open, and it creaked loudly, the sound echoing in the stillness. Inside, the air was thick and smelled of damp wood and something faintly metallic, like rust or old blood. The cabin was small, just one room. The floor was covered in dust and dirt, with patches of the wood rotting away. The walls were bare except for strange carvings scratched into the wood. There were symbols I didn't recognize, circles, lines, and shapes that seemed to twist and turn in on themselves. Some of the carvings looked like faces, their hollow eyes staring out at me. In the center of the room was a table, and on it lay a dusty, leather-bound book. The cover was cracked and faded, with no title or markings. Something about it drew me in. I reached out and brushed the dust away, revealing strange symbols embossed into the leather. My fingers tingled as I touched it, and a shiver ran down my spine. Against my better judgment, I opened the book. The pages were yellowed and brittle, filled with handwriting that didn't look human. The words were jagged, uneven, and written in a language I couldn't understand. Some pages had drawings, dark, twisted shapes that made my stomach churn. As I turned the pages, I felt the air in the cabin grow colder. The light coming through the windows seemed to dim, and shadows crept along the walls. Then I heard it, a creak behind me, like a footstep on the old wooden floor. I spun around, my heart racing, but the room was empty. I tried to laugh it off, telling myself it was just the wind or the old wood settling. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The door, which had been open when I entered, was now shut. I hadn't touched it. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at it, trying to convince myself that it had closed on its own. Then I felt it, a cold hand on my shoulder. I froze, too scared to turn around. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. There was no one in the room. I was alone, or at least I thought I was. The pressure on my shoulder disappeared, and I spun around, holding the book like a shield. The room was still empty, but the shadows on the walls seemed darker, deeper, like they were alive. I didn't wait to find out what was going on. Dropping the book on the table, I bolted for the door. It wouldn't budge. I pushed and pulled, panic rising in my chest. Finally, with a loud crack, the door swung open, and I stumbled out into the forest. The air outside felt different, heavier, like the forest was angry. The trees seemed closer together, their branches reaching out like claws. I didn't stop to look back. I ran as fast as I could, not caring which direction I went, as long as it was away from the cabin. The woods felt endless, like I was running in circles. The shadows seemed to follow me, darting between the trees. I could hear whispers, low and menacing, though I couldn't make out the words. After what felt like hours, I burst out of the dense forest and onto a familiar trail. The sunlight felt blinding after the darkness of the woods, and the sounds of birds and rustling leaves returned, comforting in their normalcy. I didn't stop running until I was back at my car. I never told anyone what happened that day. Whenever I think about it, I feel a cold knot of fear in my stomach. I've tried to go back, to find the trail that led me to the cabin, but it's like it never existed. Sometimes late at night, I dream about the book and the carvings on the walls. I see the twisted faces and feel the cold hand on my shoulder. And in those dreams, I hear the whispers again, calling me back to the cabin. I've always loved hiking. The forest is where I feel most at peace. It's a place where I can breathe deeply, hear the sounds of nature, and forget about the noise of the world. There's a trail near my house that I've hiked dozens of times. It's my favorite. The trees are tall and old, and the path winds gently through the woods. I know it like the back of my hand. One evening, after a long day, I decided to go for a walk on that trail. The sun was starting to set, but I wasn't worried. I had a flashlight in my bag, and I knew I'd be home before it got too dark. The weather was perfect, and the air was cool. I couldn't think of a better way to clear my head. As I started walking, everything felt normal. The forest was alive with the sounds I had come to expect: birds chirping, the rustle of leaves in the breeze, and the distant sound of a stream. The path was the same as always, winding gently through the trees. But after about 30 minutes, something changed. At first, it was subtle. The forest seemed quieter, like the birds had stopped singing. The air felt heavier, and the light was fading faster than I expected. I pulled out my flashlight and kept walking, thinking I'd reach the halfway point soon and turn back. Then the trail started to look different. The familiar bends and landmarks I usually passed were gone. Instead, the path seemed narrower, and the trees were thicker and closer together. I thought I had made a wrong turn, but that didn't make sense. I knew this trail. I kept walking, hoping to find something familiar, but the farther I went, the stranger the forest became. The trees looked older, their trunks wider and gnarled, with roots that twisted up from the ground like claws. Moss hung from the branches, and the air smelled damp, like the inside of a cave. That's when I noticed the silence. It wasn't just quiet, it was absolute. No birds, no insects, not even the sound of the wind in the trees. The only noise was my own breathing and the crunch of my boots on the dirt. I stopped to get my bearings, turning in a circle and shining my flashlight into the darkness. The beam of light seemed weaker than it should have been, barely cutting through the shadows. I tried to calm myself, telling myself that I'd just wandered onto an unfamiliar part of the trail. But then I heard it, a voice. It was faint at first, so soft I wasn't sure I had heard it at all. But then it came again, clearer this time. It was calling my name. My stomach dropped. I froze, shining my flashlight in the direction of the voice. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling. "Is someone there?" There was no response, just silence. Then the voice came again, from a different direction. It was my name, but it didn't sound right. It was flat, emotionless, like someone was imitating my name instead of saying it. I should have turned around and run, but I felt rooted to the spot. My heart was pounding, and my hands were shaking. I kept telling myself it was just my imagination, or maybe someone playing a prank. I forced myself to keep walking, hoping to find the trail again. But the forest only grew darker and stranger. The trees seemed to move, their branches reaching out like arms. The path was gone now, replaced by tangled roots and uneven ground. The voice came again, closer this time. It was louder, clearer, and it wasn't alone. I could hear more voices, all calling my name, overlapping each other in a chilling chorus. They sounded familiar, like people I knew, my mom, my best friend, even my own voice. "Stop it!" I shouted, my voice echoing through the forest. "Leave me alone." The voices stopped. The silence was worse than the sound. I felt like the forest was waiting, holding its breath, watching me. I turned around, ready to run, but I had no idea which way to go. Every direction looked the same, dark, endless, and unwelcoming. My flashlight flickered, and my panic rose. Then I saw something in the distance, a faint light. It wasn't the warm glow of a house or a campfire. It was pale and cold, like moonlight, and it was moving. It flickered like a flame, but it didn't feel right. Against my better judgment, I followed it. I didn't know what else to do. As I got closer, the light moved farther away, leading me deeper into the forest. I told myself it was leading me to safety, but deep down, I wasn't sure. After what felt like hours, I stumbled onto a trail. Relief washed over me, and I almost cried. The light disappeared, and I was alone again, but the trail looked familiar. I started running, desperate to get back to the safety of my car. As I ran, I heard the voices again, faint and distant, but I didn't stop. I kept running until I saw the parking lot through the trees. My car was the only one there, and the sight of it felt like salvation. I didn't stop running until I was inside with the doors locked. I sat there for a moment, trying to catch my breath, and then I started the car and drove away. I haven't been back to that trail since. I don't know what happened that night, and I don't think I want to know. But sometimes, when I'm alone, I think I hear my name being called, softly, faintly, like the forest is still waiting for me to come back. Being a park ranger, I've spent most of my life in the woods. I've seen beautiful sunrises, playful wildlife, and quiet moments that make you feel at peace with the world. But I've also experienced strange things, unexplained sounds, odd tracks, and stories that make your skin crawl. Nothing, though, compares to what happened last summer. It was a quiet evening. I was on the late shift, patrolling one of the older, less visited parts of the park. This area was deep in the forest, with trails that were barely maintained and rarely used. The sun had just set, and the forest was transitioning into its nighttime symphony of crickets and owls. I enjoyed these patrols. The solitude and silence were calming. As I walked along the trail, something caught my eye. At first, I thought it was a trick of the fading light. A shadow moved between the trees, tall and thin, darting quickly from one to the next. I stopped and stared, thinking it might be an animal or maybe a stray hiker. "Hello," I called out, shining my flashlight into the trees. "Is someone out there?" There was no response, just the steady hum of the forest at night. I shrugged it off, thinking it might have been a deer or a coyote. Still, I felt uneasy. The movement had been too quick, too strange. I continued my patrol, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The shadows seemed darker, and the trees felt taller, like they were closing in around me. Every so often, I'd hear the snap of a twig or the rustle of leaves, but every time I turned to look, there was nothing there. Then I saw it again. The shadow. It was taller than any person I'd ever seen, with long, thin limbs that moved awkwardly, almost like it was struggling to walk. It darted between the trees, staying just at the edge of my flashlight's beam. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice echoing through the forest. "This is a restricted area." Again, no response. My heart was pounding, but I tried to stay calm. I was used to dealing with trespassers, and I told myself this was just some prankster trying to scare me. I kept walking, my flashlight sweeping the trees. That's when I realized the forest had gone completely silent. No crickets, no owls, nothing. It was as if the woods were holding their breath. Then I heard it, a low, raspy sound like breathing. It was close, too close. I spun around, shining my flashlight in every direction, but the beam of light seemed weaker, as if the darkness was swallowing it. The shadow moved again, this time closer. It was no longer darting between the trees. It was standing still, watching me. Its shape was wrong. It was too tall, its limbs too long and thin. It didn't look human, but it didn't look like an animal either. I froze, unsure of what to do. My training told me to stay calm, to assess the situation, but my instincts screamed at me to run. The shadow didn't move, but I could feel its presence, heavy and oppressive, like it was pressing down on me. Finally, I forced myself to speak. "If you need help, come forward," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I can guide you out of here." It didn't respond. Instead, it tilted its head, as if it were studying me. The movement was slow, deliberate, and unnatural, like a puppet being controlled by invisible strings. That was enough for me. I turned and started walking back toward my truck, trying not to look over my shoulder. My flashlight flickered, and for a moment, I was plunged into darkness. When the beam returned, the shadow was gone. I quickened my pace, my boots crunching loudly on the gravel path. The sound of breathing returned, louder this time, and I could hear footsteps behind me, matching my own. I didn't dare look back. The path seemed to stretch on forever, like I was walking in circles. My truck, which should have been only a few minutes away, was nowhere in sight. Panic began to set in. Then I saw it, a faint light in the distance. My truck's headlights. Relief washed over me, and I broke into a run, ignoring the footsteps and the heavy breathing behind me. I reached the truck and jumped inside, locking the doors and starting the engine. As the headlights lit up the path ahead, I saw it again. The shadow stood at the edge of the trees, just beyond the light. It didn't move, but I could feel its gaze on me. I drove away as fast as I could, not stopping until I reached the ranger station. I reported the incident to my supervisor, but he just shrugged it off, saying it was probably a combination of exhaustion and my imagination. But I know what I saw. It wasn't human, and it wasn't an animal. It was something else, something that didn't belong in the woods. Or maybe something that did, something that had been there long before humans ever set foot in that forest. I've since been transferred to another park, far from those woods. I don't miss that trail, and I don't think I'll ever go back. But sometimes, late at night, I think about the shadow and wonder if it's still there, waiting for the next person to wander too deep into its territory. I grew up in a small town surrounded by forests. My friends and I spent most of our childhood exploring the woods, building forts, and daring each other to venture deeper. We had heard plenty of spooky stories about the forest, how it was haunted, how people went missing there, how strange noises could be heard at night. But we always laughed them off, as nothing more than old tales to scare kids. One summer evening, my best friend Jake and I decided to explore a part of the forest we had never been to before. It was on the other side of a small creek that we usually avoided because it was hard to cross. That day, though, we were feeling adventurous. The sun was setting, and we knew we didn't have much daylight left, but we didn't care. We found a fallen tree that stretched across the creek and used it as a makeshift bridge. Once we were on the other side, everything felt different. The trees were taller and closer together, their branches twisting like skeletal fingers. The air was cooler, and the usual sounds of birds and insects seemed muted. "This place feels weird," Jake said, his voice lower than usual. "Yeah, but it's probably just because we've never been here before," I replied, trying to sound confident. "Come on, let's keep going." We walked deeper into the forest, following a narrow path that seemed to appear out of nowhere. The farther we went, the darker it got. The sun had set completely, and the trees blocked out the moonlight, making it hard to see. That's when we heard it, a faint whisper. At first, I thought it was the wind, but the sound didn't fade or shift. It stayed constant, soft and low, like someone was speaking just out of earshot. "Did you hear that?" Jake asked, stopping in his tracks. "Yeah," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "It's probably just the wind." But we both knew it wasn't. The whispering grew louder, still too quiet to make out words, but impossible to ignore. It seemed to be coming from all around us, as if the forest itself was speaking. "We should go back," Jake said, his voice shaky. I nodded, and we turned to head back to the creek. But the path we had followed was gone. In its place were trees and undergrowth, thick and tangled. "This isn't right," I said, panic rising in my chest. "We came this way, didn't we?" "I'm sure we did," Jake said, looking around. "It's like the forest changed. We tried to find another way back, but every direction looked the same. The trees seemed to close in on us, their branches reaching out like they were alive. The whispering grew louder, almost like a chant, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. "Who's there?" Jake shouted, his voice echoing in the stillness. The whispering stopped. The silence was worse. It was heavy and unnatural, pressing down on us like a weight. "We need to keep moving," I said, grabbing Jake's arm. "We'll find the creek eventually." We started walking, not sure where we were going, just trying to put distance between us and whatever was out there. But no matter how far we went, the forest stayed the same, dark, endless, and unfamiliar. Then we saw it, a light in the distance. "Do you see that?" Jake asked, pointing. "Yeah," I said, my heart pounding. "It might be someone who can help." We hurried toward the light, stumbling over roots and branches in our haste. But as we got closer, the light began to flicker and move. It wasn't steady like a flashlight or a campfire. It was pale and cold, almost like it wasn't real. When we finally reached it, we found ourselves in a small clearing. The light was coming from a single lantern hanging from a tree branch. The lantern was old, its glass cracked and covered in grime, but the flame inside burned brightly. "Who would leave this here?" Jake whispered, looking around. "I don't know," I said, stepping closer. The lantern swung gently, even though there was no wind. As I reached out to touch it, the whispering started again, louder than before. This time, I could make out words, though they didn't make sense. They were in a language I didn't understand, but the tone was clear, angry, warning, threatening. "We need to leave," Jake said, pulling me back. I nodded, and we turned to run, but the clearing was gone. The trees had moved, closing in around us. The lantern's light dimmed, and we were plunged into darkness. "Stay close to me," I said, gripping Jake's arm. We stumbled through the forest, the whispering growing louder and more frantic. Shadows moved between the trees, shapes that were too tall and thin to be human. My flashlight flickered and died, leaving us in complete darkness. Then we saw it, a figure standing in the distance. It was tall and cloaked in shadow, its features obscured, but its eyes glowed faintly, like embers in the dark. "Run!" Jake screamed, and we bolted, not caring which direction we went. The figure didn't chase us, but the forest seemed alive, branches and roots grabbing at our legs, trying to trip us. The whispering was deafening now, a cacophony of voices that felt like they were inside my head. Finally, we broke through the trees and onto the creek's edge. The fallen tree was still there, and we scrambled across it, not daring to look back. When we reached the other side, the whispering stopped. The forest was silent again, but the oppressive feeling lingered. We didn't stop running until we were out of the woods and back in the safety of my backyard. We never talked about what happened that night. Whenever someone mentioned the forest, Jake and I would exchange a glance but say nothing. We never went back to that side of the creek, and I've avoided the woods altogether since then. But sometimes late at night, I hear whispers outside my window, soft and faint, like the forest is calling me back.